I want to officially welcome everyone to today's class. This is the third session of Exodus, Marching to Freedom with Rabbi David Silber, a continuation of his ongoing Sunday series Going Through Tanakh. Today we are learning with Rabbi Silber, who is the founder and dean of Grisha. This series has been ongoing for a couple of years now, and thank you for all who have been joining for the past months, years, or even just weeks. And with that, I'd like to hand things over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. I did want to say a few things about chapters 12 and 13. Maybe we'll start in chapter 14, hopefully today. Again, the third session out of 5. We're continuing with the book of Exodus. The goal is to reach really a turning point. If we get through the Shirat Hayam, which is really a marker in the book. It's really half the book really ends with the Song of the Sea. But we'll see how far we get. Okay, so as I had mentioned several times, the story of the Exodus in these chapters, especially chapters 12 and 13, are interspersed, the actual story, the narrative is interspersed with various rules, with various halachot, the Korban Pesach, the holiday of Chag HaMatzot, and other laws that are connected to these two events. And actually, if you look at chapter 13, towards the beginning of chapter 13, we had discussed the beginning of chapter 13 last week, God's instruction, Kadesh, we call Bechor. We talked about the Bechor, talked about the fact that later in the Torah, the Levium replaced the Bechor. But in the beginning of chapter 13, in the third pasuk, Vayomer Moshe La'am, Zachor et hayom hazeh sheyitzatem b'Mitzrayim mibeit avodim, ki b'chozek yad hotzi Hashem etchem mizeh, v'lo ye'achel chametz. So Moshe says to the people, remember this day that you left Egypt, house of bondage. God took you out with a mighty hand. You shall not eat chametz. Do not eat unleavened bread. So it's interesting that over here in the third pasuk, there's an obligation to remember this day, and we know that the Torah mentions it many times the idea of remembering the Exodus from Egypt. But over here, it's interesting that right at the very beginning, we are told to remember this day. No leavened bread shall be eaten. So this is something that is, I think, a very important point about the Chumash and about our tradition, generally speaking. The idea that one of the functions of the commandments, the mitzvot, positive, negative commandments, is to keep something else in mind. In this particular case, what we're keeping in mind is this event of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is obviously a central event. But how does one remember it? How does one keep it in mind? So what it sounds like from the Chumash is you keep it in mind in your head through memory, but we also keep it in mind by performing or not performing certain actions. In other words, not eating chametz, or conversely, eating matzah. Eating matzah during Chag HaMatzot is a way to remember the event of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Something to think about in general, the purpose of mitzvot. One of the examples I like to cite as a kind of parallel to Yetziat Mitzrayim. I think Yetziat Mitzrayim is an excellent example of where the mitzvot are in one of the intentions, at least, and the purposes of the mitzvah is to keep something in mind. But I'm also thinking about, and we've talked about it many times, the story when Yaakov is returning from the house of Lavan, also kind of Yetziat Mitzrayim. All kinds of parallels between Yaakov going into exile in the house of Lavan, and Israel and Egypt, and then leaving, and the way we leave, running, in a sense, fleeing from Egypt, fleeing from the house of Lavan. There are differences there. But when Yaakov wants to finally return and cross over into the land, he's confronted by this mysterious being, this human / angel / who knows, God-like figure. Yaakov will say afterwards, I've seen God face to face and survived. And Yaakov wrestles with this being. And Yaakov's name, he's told that his name will be changed from Yaakov to Yisrael. And as Israel, he's able to cross over to the other side. If he remains Jacob, he never crosses over. But he's able to be transformed, one might say, to transform himself through this encounter, and he's able to cross over to the other side. And there, the Torah says, very remarkably, Al Kain lo yochu, that this being injured Jacob in the sinew of the thigh. Then the Torah adds, Al Kain lo yochu b'nei Yisrael et gid hanasher shal kaf yorech ad hayom hazeh. Therefore, says the Torah, b'nei Yisrael, and it sounds like b'nei Yisrael doesn't refer to Jacob's sons. It sounds like it's sort of a flash forward to the people of Israel. The people of Israel, so that the narrator interposes into the text. The story is pushed aside for a moment, and there's a comment in the Torah. Therefore, the Jewish people don't eat the Gid HaNasher until this very day, for the angel had wounded Jacob in the sinew of the thigh. And the point of it is that this is the critical moment in the life of Yaakov, in the life of Israel, where Israel was born, one might say. Israel, the person, is born. Later, that prefigures the Israel, the nation, is born. The story of Jacob's ability to cross over, let's put it that way, his ability to cross over is connected to his name Israel. Only as Israel does he cross over. And that has to be marked. And the way it's marked, says the Torah, is by refraining from eating the Gid HaNasher. And I think in a similar fashion, we have this event of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is about becoming a people, which is about becoming Israel, having a certain identity. And this, at the moment of the Exodus, this moment when we begin to be a people, it's not just to remember it, but the Torah says, remember it, lo ye'ochel chametz, do not eat chametz, just as it says, al ken lo yochu b'nei Yisrael et Gid HaNasher. So this is a way to remember. One of the functions of the mitzvot is as a way for us to remember this this great event. I remember that in the Haggadah, many years ago, came out with the Haggadah, and one of the points I made about the Haggadah is that the idea of the night of Pesach, we are actually telling the story. In fact, this verse, Zacharet Hayom Hazeh, is the verse that the Rambam cites in his Mishnah Torah as the source for telling the story of the Exodus on the night of the Exodus. Zacharet Hayom Hazeh, the Rambam says, is parallel to Zacharet Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, Kiddush. Because Zacharet Yom HaShabbat L'Kadsho, the Rambam is saying, in effect, remember the Sabbath day on the Sabbath. You make Kiddush on Shabbat. So we are remembering, one might even mentioning or remembering the Shabbat on Shabbat. The Rambam says, without going into any, he simply states it. This verse also, Zacharet Hayom Hazeh, means on the day itself. So on the night at the Seder, we are remembering, we are not just remembering, but telling the story. The source for the Rambam is Zacharet Hayom Hazeh, but he calls it the mitzvah of Sipu Yetziat Mitzrayim. But actually, the idea of remembering the Exodus, we have it twice a day. Every time we say the Shema, the whole Shema, in the third paragraph it says, Ani Hashem Elohechem asher hotzeti etchem mi'eretz Mitzrayim. I'm the God who took you out of Egypt. So there's a mitzvah every day to remember the Exodus, not to tell the story, but to remember the Exodus. And we fulfill that mitzvah every time we say the Shema in the morning and every time we say the Shema in the evening. And our God quotes the Mishnah and says, twice a day, point to Ben Zoma, Rosa Ben Azariah, twice a day we are remembering the Exodus. On the night of Passover, we don't just remember the Exodus, we actually tell the story. And I suggest that that's actually what we read in the Haggadah. If you remember, the Haggadah tells us of five great rabbis who were together on the night of Passover. They were telling the story, and they were so engrossed in the story that they were up the entire night until their pupils came to them and said, Rabotenu, Higiyah Zman Kriyat Shema Shel Shachari. They said, our teachers, the night is over. And they said, it's time to recite the morning Shema. And I suggested in the Haggadah, that that's exactly the point. That the great mitzvah of telling the story is once a year. On the night that we actually experience freedom, we are to tell the story of our freedom. But there's a mitzvah every single day of the year. In fact, twice a day. It's just to remember it. The idea of to remember it, I suggested, is by mentioning just briefly every day, we keep it fresh. We keep it in mind. That's the idea of the Shema. The Shema is a kind of mini Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim. And in a kind of similar way, that's what you have over here. We are to remember this event, this Exodus. This is the event that the Torah singles out that must be remembered. So many mitzvot are connected to remembering the Exodus, but one way to remember it is not just in your head to think about it, but in terms of what we do or what we don't do. Mitzvot aseh, mitzvot lo taseh, matzah, chametz, etc. That's the point over here. Remember, lo ye'achel chametz. I just wanted to add that one point over here. That's number one. Okay, I'll make a couple more points and I'll stop and take comments or questions. I think what I just said is a very important point, actually. Okay, now let me make another point about this idea of leaving Mitzrayim. As we studied, we can only leave Mitzrayim once we first bring the Korban Pesach. And the Torah makes this point very clearly, that the prerequisite to leaving Egypt is the bringing of this particular sacrifice. And the Torah makes this point because when the Torah describes the way we are to eat the Korban Pesach is a kind of communal or family, quasi-communal meal shared by all the participants who all eat of it. But the Torah also tells us the manner in which we are to eat it. And this is found in chapter 12, in verse number 11. It describes the way it is to be eaten. V'kacha tochlu oto. This is the manner. This is the way in which you shall eat it. Matnechem chagurim, nalechem beraglechem, umakelchem biyedchem. V'achaltem oto b'chipazon. Pesach hu Hashem. So this is how you shall eat it. Here they translate your loins girded, sandals on your feet, staff in your hand. Eat it hurriedly. It is a Passover offering to the Lord. In other words, you're eating it, says the Torah. When you eat the Korban Pesach, you're eating it and you're ready to go. Your bags are packed. Your staff is in your hand. Your sandals are on your feet. You eat it b'chipazon. It is a Pesach to God. So clearly what the Torah is suggesting is you're all set to go. You're all be ready to leave at an instant, but you can't leave until first you bring the Korban Pesach. So the Korban Pesach is the prerequisite to leaving, and we spoke about this. I don't want to go over it again. As to why we can only leave once we bring the Korban Pesach, the core idea was only when there's some sense of being a people. Before you leave, can you actually begin the journey? Because in the course of the journey, you will fully become a people. But if there's no sense of peoplehood before you leave, then there's no point to leave. And that's the Korban Pesach, and that's the people come together, people serve God together. Okay, it's families, but it's all the families at the same time. It's the transition from family to nation. And that's the way the Korban Pesach is eaten in the land of Egypt. Now, of course, as the Talmud notes in more than one place, there is a difference between the Korban Pesach that was eaten in Egypt and the Korban Pesach that will be eaten in the future generations. What is known in that tradition is Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Ledorot. So the Gemara discusses differences between the way the Pesach is eaten in Egypt and the Pesach will be eaten in the future. Yes, in chapter 12, there's a whole section, so Chukat HaPasach. The Torah will say in chapter 12, this is the rule of the Pesach. Verse number 43. Vayomer Hashem Moshe v'Aaron zot Chukat HaPasach. And there are rules about the Korban Pesach, who may eat it, who may not eat it. So there are all kinds of rules about the future, but there are also rules about Mitzrayim itself. So in the future, you won't eat the Korban Pesach, loins girded, staff in hand. You're not going anywhere. I'll come back to that. But there is this idea that in Mitzrayim, it is a prerequisite. Before I get to something else about that point, I want to make a different point about the Korban Pesach and the great significance of the Korban Pesach. So it's the prerequisite to becoming a people. And just in terms of what we looked at last week briefly, in terms of the Levium replacing the Bechor, I pointed out that in the book of Bamidbar, which talks about the Bechor being replaced by the Levi, the chapter that appears right after the Levi replaces the Bechor is the whole story of Pesach Sheni. That is to say, there was a situation, says the Torah in the book of Bamidbar in chapter 9, that there were some people who had become Tameh for whatever reason. The Torah doesn't say. And they went to Moshe and they said, listen, we are Tameh, we can't eat the carbon, we can't bring the Pesach by the rules that you've taught us. But Lo Mani Gara, why should we be deprived to partake of the sacrifice in the appropriate time amongst all the other Jews? In other words, we're also Jews. And why should we be deprived of the carbon Pesach? So it's not just any old sacrifice. It's a sacrifice which was part of the definition of what it means to be Jewish. And the people said to Moshe, why should we be deprived? Why shouldn't we be given the opportunity to bring the carbon Pesach? And that the point I'm making is you see the degree to which the carbon Pesach is constitutive of what it means to be Jewish. Why should we be deprived? Because you're Tameh. What kind of question? But Moshe doesn't say that. Moshe says, you've got a point. Wait here. I don't have an answer. Let's see what God has to say about this. Then, of course, we have the rule of the Pesach Sheni, the second chance that's given to those who were unable, for good reason, to bring the carbon Pesach. But the point I want to underscore is the great significance of the carbon Pesach. Okay. Since I'm talking about the carbon Pesach, let me make one last point about the carbon Pesach, which is a very important point in the Chumash. And that is the following. The Torah said in chapter 12, and I just alluded to it a minute ago, that God speaks to Moshe and Aaron, Zot Chukat HaPasach. This is the law, the rule of the Pesach, and there are a whole bunch of rules that are given. Who may partake of the carbon Pesach, who may not partake of the carbon Pesach. The Torah calls that Chukat HaPesach. It's interesting that yesterday we read the parasha of Chukat, the parasha in Bamidbar of Chukat, and the Chukat, the Chok, in last week's parsha, that is the Chok of the Parah Aduma. Parah Aduma, the red heifer, which is instrumental in purifying one who has come into contact with a corpse. That's Chukat Pesach, and that is in the Jewish tradition is the quintessential Chok. Rashi says doesn't seem to have any, and you can't understand why the nature of it. The meaning is hidden from us. The rationale is hidden from us, and there's a great discussion among the various commentaries about mitzvot in general. Do they all have reasons? Some have no reason, simply an arbitrary command. There's a whole long discussion. What's interesting is that here, Pesach is also called the Chok. So Chukat Pesach, the Medrash connects them. What's curious about Chukat Pesach is that when it comes to the Pesach, this is where in the Torah, in two different places, the Torah speaks about someone asking a question. Someone asks a question. The two different questions. One is that in the future, Vayok Yamru Alechem B'Neichem Moha Avoda Azot Lachem. Back in chapter 12, once again, we are told to keep this Ushmartem et verse number 24. Ushmartem et Davar Hazeh talks about the carbon Pesach. Keep this chok forever. So it's a statute that is forever, beginning in chapter 12, verse number 21 or 22. I can't see it. Let's see, verse number 20. Well, I guess it's 21. Moshe has commanded the people, 21. Moshe commands the people to take the carbon Pesach, and you're going to slaughter it, and you're going to take a hyssop, and you're going to dip it in the blood, and you're going to smear it on the doorposts and on the lintel, right? And don't leave your house until the morning. God will pass through Egypt. God will see the blood, and God will either pass over the house or protect the house, Pasach or Pesach, etc. And do this, Shmartem et hadavar hazeh l'chok l'cho uvanecha. You will keep this. You will observe this as an institution for all time. And the next verse, and when you come into the land, Ushmartem et havodah azot. You come into the land, you will do the same thing. You will be shmartem. We talked about that word last week. Your children will ask you, what is this? What is this? What do you mean by this ritual? You will say, Zevach Pesach hu Hashem, asher posacha botei b'nei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim. V'nog poet Mitzrayim v'et boteinu Mitzil, v'yikoda on v'yishtachavu. So the Torah here has a question. Your children will ask you, why are you doing this? What is this about? And you will say, this is the Paschal sacrifice, the Zevach Pesach hu Hashem. The God who Pasach, either passed over or hovered above the houses of Israel in Egypt. When God smote the Egyptians, God saved our house. I'll get back to that in a minute. And the people bowed down, bowed low, fine. But what is the question? What are the children asking over here in chapter 12, verse number 26? What is their question? What are they asking about? So what is the plain reading of the Chumash? What are they asking about? You come into the land, you're going to do this thing. And the kids are going to ask you, why are you doing this? Why are you doing what? The plain reading of the Chumash. What in particular are the kids asking you? Why are you what? What it sounds like.
Korban Pesach.
What about the Korban Pesach? What?
Making Korban Pesach.
No, I think it means eating the matzah.
No, it doesn't. No, it does mention that. It mentions the Pesach. It only mentions the Pesach.
Right, but we're
my
not
point is
in the land anymore, but we're doing the symbol that
when you
replaces.
come into right. But what are you doing that they're asking about? What are they wondering about?
Why matzah and not one of the four questions? Why tonight do we eat matzah instead of
It
bread?
doesn't say anything about matzah. I don't say a word about matzah here.
Just before you were analogizing the eating
I understand, but what does the Chumash say right here on the spot?
Mm.
No, it's strikes me what the Chumash says. Just a plain reading of it is.
What does this mean
Daddy,
to you?
Why are you spraying blood on the door? That's the question.
the door.
That's what
Why,
it
you think
mentions. When you come into the land, you shall dip the blood. You shall take the blood, put it on the doorpost and the lintel, and fine. And Moshe says, and God will come by, God will pass over the house or whatever, and you should do this thing, davar hazeh, forever. Even when you come into the land, do this avodah. And when the children ask you, what are you doing? You'll say, because God passed over the house. When God smote we're marking the house. That's what it sounds like. We're marking off the house. This is the house of the destroying, avenging angel or destroying angel does not enter. That's why I put blood on the door. To remember, that's what happened back in Egypt. The house was secured by means of the blood on the door. That's what it sounds like to me, the plain reading of the Chumash. That's what it says. This is what you do. It doesn't mention the eating. And in point of fact, I would say, when you come into the land, we know that sacrifices, well, some sacrifices are eaten inside the house. So it wouldn't be such a strange thing to eat sacrifices. They wouldn't ask, how come we're eating this meat? You brought a sacrifice. But the idea of smearing the blood on the door, that's another story. That's racial. What are you putting blood on the door? That's what it sounds like in the Chumash. Now, there's some of the commentaries, basically, who deal with it, say that's not the question. They're asking, as you had suggested more generally, why did we bring this Korban Pesach? Well, when you read the Chumash, it doesn't sound that way. It sounds like the question is, why are you putting blood on the door, on the doorpost, on the lintel, etc.? The reason the commentaries don't want to go there is very simply because this is what it says in Sefer Shemot. However, when you keep reading the Chumash, which is a very good idea, and you get to Sefer Devarim, there the Torah has a completely different description of Korban Pesach, completely different. But among other things, what the Torah says in Sefer Devarim, in chapter 16 of Sefer Devarim, is that when you come into the land and you have this central place of worship, go to Chal Lasot et HaPesach bi'achad shi'arecha. You shall not bring the Korban Pesach inside your own gates. inside your own cities, and certainly inside your own homes. Rather, everybody comes up to the central place. Let's call it Jerusalem. The Torah doesn't say Jerusalem, but it's the place that God chooses. And you bring the sacrifice there. And there's no doorpost, and there's no lintel, and there's no blood. So, I mean, this is an interesting question. What do we do? There's a blatant contradiction between the two sections of the Torah, because the emphasis in here is all about the house. The central word in the entire story is bayit. On the house, in the house, by the house, save the house, spare the house, right? Members of the house. And in Sefer Devarim, on the contrary, the Korban Pesach is a sacrifice that everybody goes up to Yerushalayim to bring the Korban Pesach. So that's a very interesting point about the shift. I think when one is studying this, studying the Korban Pesach in much more detail, one must take into account the shift, and in general, the shift in Sefer Devarim, which moves everything to a kind of central location. So one must be aware of that. When I read the Chumash over here, it sounds like Sefer Shemot is not taking that into account at all. What it sounds like in Sefer Shemot, to be totally blunt about it, that even in the future, you were going to put the blood on the doorpost and on the lintel. Of course, in Sefer Devarim, it's all changed. You can't bring it inside your house. And it's interesting, just as a small remark, and then I'll stop for a moment and take any comments or questions. But sometimes the Jewish people have certain practices, call them a minhag or whatever. And the study of minhag is very interesting, because sometimes what the practice does is not doing, in a sense, something new. But very often the practice that the minhag of the people, in a certain sense, goes back to some earlier state. I mean, there's no ritual which is more home-centered in our tradition more than the Passover Seder. You think about it, they're opening up the door, right, and inviting people into the house, etc. It's a ritual which is grounded inside the home, inside the house. The only thing similar might be Hanukkah, but Pesach is truly the idea of the house. And the idea of the house actually takes us back to what we're studying in the book of Shemot. In the book of Devarim, it becomes much more of a ritual on the kind of national level. But here it doesn't sound that way at all. It sounds like the book of Shemot is completely oblivious to what it says later about, it contradicts it. Now, there also are other contradictions between Sefer Devarim in terms of the Korban Pesach, but I'm not going to get into those in terms of but in general, Sefer Devarim in general, there are many contradictions. But I just wanted to point out that it even underscores to what degree the idea of the bayit is very central over here. Because this is the question. When you just read the Chumash, that's what they're asking. What kind of avoda is this? The commentaries who want to always reconcile and resolve, no, they're not asking about the blood. They're not going to do the blood in the future.
Rabbi Silber,
it doesn't sound that way, actually. Yes.
Could you say, though, that chapter 13, though, really gives, like, the view that we see about remembering? Like, verse, so verse 3. It's always Yetziat Mitzrayim that's emphasized, what you need to remember. Verse 3, I think there's what do you do? He got it levincha, v'yom hahu lemor b'tzeiti mimitzrayim. I mean, I'm not.
No, I agree.
I'm not putting the Korban Pesach to the side, but I'm just saying, and not putting the house to the side. But what is it that we have to remember?
No, of course, I totally agree with you. The basic thing you remember is the Exodus. The Korban Pesach is a prerequisite to the Exodus. But in the Chumash, it is Yetziat Mitzrayim that we're remembering, and not only in terms of ritual, but even in terms of the way you treat the other person, the way you treat the stranger. There are all kinds of rules that there's no question, and in terms of our ritual, even in terms of Kiddush. I mean, we talk of Shabbat. We say Yetziat Mitzrayim. We say that in the Kiddush. It is the central event is the Exodus. I'm just pointing out that the Korban Pesach is what allows you to have the Exodus. Without the Korban Pesach, there is no Exodus in the first place. So this is something which is, I think, is, a very, and since you mentioned chapter 13, here again we have the Vigadat Torah. We have two different places here. The first, in terms of the Korban Pesach, what is this avoda? And you answer, well, this was the prerequisite we couldn't leave until. And then in chapter 13, as you point out, that when you come into the land, you shall observe this following. You shall not eat chametz, you shall eat matzah, shivat yamin tocham matzot, etc. You shall not have any chametz in your possession, wherever it may be. And then, V'gala togavincha bayom ahu lebar, a very difficult verse, ba'avur zeh asah Hashem li b'tzeiti mitzrayim. That's a verse that appears in the Haggadah about 4 different times, and it's unclear what it means actually. But the point is that one thing is clear, that here for a second time in this context, it's all about instructing the children. I want to say something about that. I really want to point out, and others have pointed this out as well, but it's very striking that yesterday we read Parshat Chukat about the Parah Aduma, and Rashi says Chok is something nobody understands. The Chok, the Parah Aduma, no one understands it. Okay, others disagree with Rashi. No, others say it's hard to understand, but there certainly is a rationale and a reason. Everything has a reason. The Rambam thought it was ludicrous to suggest that a mitzvot with no reason. And he gives his own reasons for many of the mitzvot. But in any event, the quintessential chok, in which the reason is at least obscure to us, or maybe it contains a kind of internal contradiction. It purifies those that are impure, and it makes impure those that do the right of purification. The tahorim and tameim, but that Parah Aduma is the ultimate chok, so chukat Torah. But in chukat Pesach, actually, which the Torah says Zot chukat Pesach, this is the place where the Torah, more than any other place, emphasizes that we have to explain why we do something, both in terms of chapter 12 and chapter 13. They're going to ask you questions, you're going to answer. If they don't ask questions, Vigadat, you should tell them. So it's interesting to look at these two chukim, as it were, with a completely different focus. I did want to make one other last point, and again, I'll stop and take any comments or questions, but why is it over here that there is this emphasis on you will teach your children, or you will tell your children? Why here is the Torah emphasizing to this extent? So I wanted to make a point, which I think is a very important point about the story. And it takes us back to the beginning of the book of Exodus. The very beginning of the book of Exodus, for those who are studying here, probably remember this, but it doesn't matter, I'll repeat it. And that is that in the beginning of the book of Exodus, it says, Vayomet Yosef b'chol echav b'chol adarahu, Joseph and his brothers, and that generation died. And there emerged a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And he begins the persecution of the Jewish people, the Inui, the Avdut, etc. And what we saw at the time when we started studying the book of Exodus, that the Torah says the persecution takes place after the death of Joseph and his brothers and that generation. Why did the Torah say in that generation? Because the Torah wants you to count the generations. And after the death of Joseph's brothers, say Levi, the persecution doesn't begin in the time of Levi. It begins after the death of Levi, death of Joseph's brothers. So Levi's son is Kahat. He's the first generation. And Kahat's son is Amram. He's second generation. And Amram's sons are Moshe and Aaron, third generation. Moses is a third generation Jew. But we remember the covenant with Abraham, where God said to Abraham, V'dar revi'i yashuvu heina, the fourth generation shall return to the land. So we, the reader, knows something that Moses himself does not know. We know better than him. Because Moses probably thinks he's going to take everybody out and bring them to the land. And we know that's never going to happen. Because the Torah said, God said to Abraham, 3 generations will leave with great possessions, and because we know this from the very beginning, our focus is not primarily on the people Moshe is speaking to, but rather to the next generation. The significance of God sparing the Bechor then takes on a deep significance because these are the people that are going to possess the land. This generation will in fact possess the land. And that's the reason, in my opinion, that when it comes to the Korban Pesach and the Matzah, and Yetziat Mitzrayim in general, subtly, there's tremendous emphasis on teaching the next generation, which of course the Passover Haggadah picks up and actually runs with it. Not just 2 questions, but there are 4 questions, different kinds of children, etc., etc. Community consists of different components, different factors. But the point is that the focus then has got to be the next generation, because God said to Abraham, and that's the reason I think that we encounter, both in chapter 12, chapter 13, the questions that in the future they're going to ask you. What is the significance of all this? And we have to have the answers. And Moshe is already instructing us in Egypt that we have to think about the explanations, to tell people, why do you do this? Oh, we do it because, well, I don't know why. It doesn't seem to make any sense, but this is what we do. So the Rambam describes that as a kind of sickness. There are people that are sick, so the Rambam says. They think if you tell somebody, why do you do something? Oh, there is no reason for it. It's arbitrary. Rambam says, well, if someone says to you, everything I do is arbitrary, you would say something's wrong with you. But to say God does something arbitrary, that's okay. So the Rambam says that's great. That makes no sense for the Rambam, and therefore he attempts to give a reason for all the mitzvot, etc. One may not care for the reasons that he gives, by the way, but that's a separate conversation. In any event, that's the point I wanted to make out why Dafka over here, in these chapters, we have this interesting focus on V'amartem Zevach Pesach or V'higadato Levincha V'yom Hu Ve'mar. Okay, let me stop here for a moment and take any comments or questions.
A question? You had said that, it's Andre. You had said that there were 2 places in the Torah that there were questions, and the first one was the one that we're so familiar with on Pesach, and Maha Avodah Hazot Lachem. What's the second big question?
Well, I would say it's a question, but I was inaccurate when I said that. The second time is not a question.
Uh-huh.
The second time here, it's a statement more than a question. The child does not ask you, but rather the Higadita. What I meant to say was not a question. Now, there are other questions in the Torah. In the book of Dvarim, it says in Vayoki Yishalcha Bincha, there it says your child will ask you, Mo'edot v'yachukim v'yamishpatim, that the Haggadah ascribes to, actually there's a third one, that the Haggadah ascribes to the Chacham. But actually, there is another question here. I retract what I said. There is actually another question. Let me find what this other question is. The other question is, just one second. Yes, chapter 13, verse number 14. Chapter 13, verse 14. There we have the other question. It talks about, beginning in verse number 11, when God will bring us into the land, the mitzvah of redeeming the firstborn and sacrificing the firstborn animal. What's called pidyon haben, and the din of bechor, that the first of the animals is given over to the Kohen and sacrificed. And the Torah says in verse number 14, what is this all about? Redeeming the firstborn, giving the firstborn as the sacrifice. Mazot. The Haggadah ascribes the question of mazot to the tam, to the simple child. Not asking a profound question. What's this all about? So mazot, and you will say once again that God took us out of Egypt from the place of suffering, and God killed the firstborn of the Egyptians, and God spared our firstborn, and therefore I am sacrificing the firstborn, and the firstborn of the children I am redeeming. So that's actually the second question. So actually you have 3 places. Thank you for that clarification, actually. 3 places over here in these 2 chapters, 3 different places. 3 of the 4 questions, so-called questions of the Haggadah, are found in chapter 12 and chapter 13. And the third one, Mazot, is once again about the Bechor. Why are we sacrificing the Bechor? Why we have this Pidyon Ben, redeeming the firstborn? And the answer, once again, is as a remembrance to recall this event of leaving Mitzrayim. And again, Korban Pesach was for us the prerequisite, but Makat Bechorot is what actually prompts Mitzrayim to let us free. So that's, of course, over here as well, and that's a very important point. Okay,
There's
any other
another
comments or questions?
But just how do we know that Dor Revi'i Yashuvu Hena, when Hashem is talking to Abraham, doesn't refer to the Dor Revi'i from Abraham? Yitzchak,
It
Yaakov,
does.
and then Yosef's
It
children.
does refer to Dor Avraham, refers to both. The Chumash actually doesn't say. I mean, we right. It's a very good point, and I've spent a lot of time in the past talking about the fact that Dor Revi'i, 3 and 4 generations, refers. In fact, when one is reading the Chumash and Sefer Bereshit, it will never dawn upon you that it refers to Egypt. The simple reading is Dor Revi'i is from Avraham, actually. 3 generations of suffering, and the 4th generation shall possess the land, which is the story of course, of Sefer Bereshit. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are strangers and sojourners in the land. Yaakov endures Abdut and Inui and Gerut, Lavan Garti. And Yaakov's children in the story of Shem begin the conquest of the land. So it's actually even more complicated than that. But it's no doubt what you're saying is 1000% right. That the plain reading of the Chumash is that the fulfillment will take place on the symbolic level or the level of family in the book of Bereshit. But then when you open up the next book, and in chapter 1 you have Inui and you have Avdut, right? And you have Gerut in chapter 2, it becomes obvious that this is also a fulfillment, not on the level of family, but the level of peoplehood. And there are 2 different fulfillments of this covenant. One on the level of family in Sefer Bereshit, and the main character is Yaakov in the house of Lavan. And then there's a fulfillment of the same kind of suffering, whatever, in the story of Mitzrayim. Now, God, of course, understood this very well. And, right? Yaakov Avinu. My Haggadah was called Seil Lamad. It's exactly the point. That this Yaakov, that we are in Egypt before we ever get to Egypt. That the experience of Yaakov in the house of Lavan and the experience of Israel in Egypt are more or less parallel experiences. That's, of course, very true. And there's more than one fulfillment. And the Haggadah, by the way, makes another leap and says, you know something? If there's a fulfillment of the covenant in Sefer Bereshit, and there's a fulfillment of the covenant in Sefer Shemot and beyond, maybe there's a fulfillment of this covenant in many, many times. Maybe maybe it happens all the time. Maybe it's cyclical. Maybe it repeats throughout history. That's the claim of the Passover Haggadah. So what you touched on is something central to the Haggadah. And yes, of course, it is a fulfillment, but it's also a fulfillment in Mitzrayim. That's the point. Most people don't realize it's a fulfillment in Sefer Bereshit, but of course it is. That's the plain reading of it. God speaks to Abraham, 1st generation. Yaakov is 3rd generation. Yaakov undergoes the Inui and the Abdut and the Gerut. And then the 4th generation. Now, I have more to say about the 4th generation, but that's be a whole separate shiur, but leave that for now. But yes, 100%.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you for the question. Yes, Razel, what do you want to say?
Rabbi Silber, is there any reason why in both cases that you mentioned, their memory has to do with refraining from something rather than positively doing
That's a
something?
very, very good question. That's an excellent question. I mean, because we would think that to remember something is more about what we do. Now, in the case of Mitzrayim, it's not just refraining. It's true that he mentions chametz, the Torah mentions chametz over here, but the Torah also speaks about the matzah. In other words, not having chametz is more about not even having chametz because you have to eat the matzah. Chag HaMatzot, which is the matzah of, the key is actually the matzah. It's called Chag HaMatzot. But your point is well taken. That actually we would have expected some kind of positive act to remember, whereas in the case of Yaakov, wrestles with the angel, and the verse over here specifically singles out the chametz. But over here, it's less of a problem because not eating chametz is one piece of a much bigger range of, a whole range of different laws. I'll mention another one in a minute. But your point is still well taken. I've thought about that many, many times myself as to why over there with Yaakov, it's about what you don't do as opposed to what you do. I have no good answer to you, but you point out that it is interesting to note that we remember by abstaining. I mean, Shabbat is interesting also. In Shabbat, yes, there is a way to observe the Shabbat in a positive sense, That's what the Ramban writes about a great length in more than one place. At the end of the day, fundamentally, Shamar Yom HaShabbat is not to do work. So, I mean, it's also what you don't do. It's the restraining, which also is a way to mark. In fact, the holy day is fundamentally a day in which you don't work. That's probably the key component, is what you don't do. But you raised a very interesting question. Okay, let me.
Is
yes.
it possible that the concept of refraining is a way of remembering that it's not you, but it's something beyond you?
That is a very interesting point. I have to think about that. Right, that's something which is, something that is very. I mean, I think your point is very interesting in terms of, especially in terms of Yaakov wrestling with this ish. In other words, Yaakov becomes Israel by virtue of being wounded. In other words, Yaakov survives the encounter. He's able to cross over, but he's only able to cross over into the promised land, into the covenantal land, when he encounters some kind of something which actually recalls his own vulnerability. And I think you've hit on something which is very profound in the Chumash, which is that only when the way to connect to God in the Chumash is when you embrace your own humanity. When people think they're God, is when they can't actually connect to God. We're not God. As Abraham achieves this eternal covenant with God at the Akedah, at the moment he's willing to give up his son.
You said the same thing about David.
He has no future.
You said the same thing about David.
Yes, the David story is parallel to David, who says, "Kill me in my father's house. I'm willing to step down from the kingship." And that's based on the Akedah, actually. That story is based on the Akedah. But I think it goes back to the beginning of the Torah, where God throws us out of the Garden of Eden, lest we eat of the tree of life, and we will be godlike. God doesn't want the human to think that the human is godlike. That gets us always into deep trouble. So the way you connect to God is by affirming the fact that we are not God. I think something fundamental to Judaism, I think this is a place where overall Judaism and Christianity, with certain understandings of Christianity, took a different form. And that is, for the Chumash, I think, in my reading of the Chumash, there's an unbridgeable chasm between God on one hand and the human being on the other. The two can never occupy the same realm. That's my take on it. And God's concern is that people may think that they are, in fact, that they are God or God-like. And I think that's very dangerous, and God doesn't want that. But if you're willing to affirm your own humanity in the deepest way, you can enter into a covenant. Covenant doesn't mean you are God, but covenant means you can connect in the deepest way. And I think that's the story of the Akedah and David, and probably Chaim is pointing out, that's the story of Yaakov becoming Israel. He becomes Israel dafka when he is wounded and actually almost killed. Jacob says, "I've encountered God and I have survived." Survival, that's one thing, but I'm not God. Comes to recognize that. It's a miracle how I was able to encounter God and yet I survived. Yes, I'm wounded, of course. But the brokenness actually is a positive thing. The brokenness is the affirmation of what it means to be human. So I think thank you for that point, Chaim. I think that's a really important point in general in the Torah, at least the way my understanding of it. And I think that plays out in a whole variety of ways. I think that's an important point. Let me mention, yes, Debbie, what do you want to say?
I think what you're saying, in my mind, it's when we accept our vulnerability and realize what's missing in us, as opposed to, let's say, Nadav and Avihu, who wanted to meld with God, and then Hashem pushes them back and says no. In other words, aspiring to be at one with Hashem is when Hashem pushes you back. When you accept that you're lacking, that there is a piece lacking, that's when Hashem accepts you. That's the theme of all of this. It seems to me.
Right. I mean, the Nadav and Avihu interpretation, let's leave that for that's an interesting question. But I would say in the Chumash, I would add there's another factor in the Chumash, that when accepting one's own vulnerability or limitations is for the Chumash what allows you theoretically to recognize the other people's vulnerabilities. Torah says it straight out. Ahavtam et hager, ki gerim heitem b'eretz Mitzrayim. And Rashi's comment is, don't think you're better than the next guy. That's always dangerous thinking, you know? Well, that ger, what do you think you are? You're also a ger, you know what I mean? And I think that point of coming to terms with who we really are, as opposed we are all powerful, we can do no wrong, etc., which always leads us to bad places. I think that the Chumash, that's something very central. And probably the idea of, it is very striking, and there's a lot more to say about this, that the central event we ought to remember is the Exodus from Egypt. That is actually very striking when you think about it, because, you know, you would have expected a different thing. You would expect maybe the conquest of the land would be the central thing to think of. Remember, right? Remembering that we conquered the land. But we don't have any really memory of that in the Chumash. We're remembering the fact that we left Mitzrayim, and I would add that virtually everybody who leaves Mitzrayim dies in the desert. I mean, you're talking about, we left Mitzrayim. We wandered about 40 years in the desert and dropped dead. You know what I mean? We never got there, actually. The next generation gets there. But we began a process. And the idea of beginning the process but not completing it, that's something which is that is one of the central themes. And it plays out in so many ways. Even the land is not your land. Chumash makes that clear. It's God's land, right? You're strangers and sojourners in my land. I think that thinking, that understanding that, yes, it's our land if we understand that it's not our land. That's what the Chumash says. So I think that's something which is, I think we're touching on something here which is, to me, central. Central to the Chumash, I think central to the theology of the Torah. I think there's something very basic about this. And it plays out in a whole variety of ways, in terms of the land, in terms of, you know, how we see ourselves vis-a-vis God and vis-a-vis the other, etc. So, all right.
I had one other thought on Pesach Sheni, that
yes.
It always struck me as a very human request. That Pesach Sheni was an integral, central, earth-shattering experience for them in their lives. And they didn't want to be denied the anniversary of it. In other words, all the other korbanot, if they couldn't bring them, they couldn't bring them. But this was the first anniversary of remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim. And so they were, I guess, flabbergasted that because they were Tamei Lenefesh, they couldn't bring it. So they went to Moshe saying, you know, all these rules are new to us, but we can't bring a Korban Pesach. I mean, it strikes me as such a human response to an earth-shattering experience of theirs. And I think that's what...
No, I agree with you. And I think that I can't, right, these are big questions that are being raised, but I would say the following about Pesach Sheni and about Pedot Tzlafchan also, which is, the point is that, first of all, the law seems to be changed. Actually, God changes the law, okay? But God only changes the law once the people make a demand. Right? The people, and the demand is a religious demand. It's a spiritual demand. We see ourselves as part of the people. We're God's people. God saved us as well. We want to mark this event. We want to be part of this people that serve God, etc. And that, in the case of the Chumash, of course, when God is speaking, it's easy to find answers. But, you know, I think if one thinks more broadly about practice, about halacha, etc.
And Hashem adds on derech rechoka. That wasn't part of it.
Right, of course. I mean, we look at it carefully and see what it is. But fundamentally, what it's saying, in my view, is that the rituals are there at the end of the day to move us spiritually forward, not just to keep us in the same place, and certainly not to move us backwards. So I think that now the way it goes about in the absence of God's statements, that's the question for our tradition. We have an interpretive tradition, but these are big questions, and I don't want to get into this right now. But I think that you can't really study the story of the Exodus without raising some of these questions. So this is the main thing we're supposed to remember. Okay, let me just make one last point about the idea of remembering. And that's the following. Speaking about halacha. So chapter 13. Chapter 13 is a short chapter. That's what well, actually, chapter 13 is not so short, but Paschal Bo, before you get to the middle of 13, Shalach, which maybe we'll start with next time, but in chapter 13, we have a mitzvah that's mentioned two different times. It's mentioned in chapter 13, verse number 9, right? When it talks about V'yadato levincha, you shall tell your child, teach your child that, again, Bavuzer aso Hashem li b'tzeiti mitzrayim. I didn't get into that verse. It's not a simple verse to translate, but okay. But whatever it is saying, it sounds like what's one of two things. It's either saying we are doing all of these mitzvot, right? We're doing all these mitzvot because of the miracles that God performed for us, right? The miracles, we are, because God performed the miracles, we are doing these mitzvot. We're doing the mitzvot because of what God did to us when God took us out of Egypt. That's one way to read it. And the other way to read it is something along the lines of the Ibn Ezra, which is that God took us out of Egypt to serve God. And one of the ways that we serve God is through various observances. This is why we have the Ibn Ezra put it in terms of God took us out of Egypt to be God's servants. And to be God's servants is to follow God's rules. That's certainly the interpretation of the Ibn Ezra. But in any event, that's the V'yadato levincha. And then the next verse. L'man tiyeh Torat Hashem b'ficha, ki b'yod chazakah hotziach Hashem mitzrayim. So here, let's read this translation. This shall serve you as a sign on your hand and a reminder on your forehead, literally between your eyes, in order that the teaching of the Torah be in your mouth, that with a mighty hand the Lord freed you from Egypt. And this verse number 9, is repeated again in verse number 16. Beginning in verse 11, a new parsha, then it talks about Bechor in verse number 12, and about redeeming of the firstborn, and about the Peter Chamor, and instead of killing the Chamor, you can bring you give the Kohen a seh, give a lamb to the Kohen. Then it talks about your child's going to ask you a question, and once again you talk about the redemption of God and the killing of the firstborn, etc. And again, the last verse. So here, verse number 16 seems similar, almost parallel to verse number 9. And the question is, what does this mean? A sign on your hand, a remembrance between your eyes, that the Torah of God be in your mouth. So this chapter 13, by the way, in halacha, is a very important chapter. Now, why is chapter 13 an important halacha, important chapter in halacha? Who knows? Chapter 13, why is it such an important halacha?
It's in the tefillin.
Yes, exactly. Because in the tefillin that we have, so the tefillin, there's a tefillin that you place on your hand, and the tefillin that you place on your head. And the source of tefillin is right here. The Ot al Yorecha, it says Zikaron beinecha, and the second verse is Totafot beinecha, etc. And the tefillin have 4 parshiot. What are the 4 parshiot in the tefillin? So first of all, the tefillin you put on your hand and on your head. They both have the same parshiot. The difference is that in the tefillin on your hand, the 4 parshiot are written on one piece of parchment, and the tefillin on your head, there are 4 different compartments. But there are 4 parshiot in the tefillin. 2 of them are right here. The first is called Kadesh, which is the parsha from verse number 1 through verse number 10. And the second parsha is called Vayaki Yiriacha, which is verse number 11 through verse number 16. And these are two of the four parashiot of Tefillin. Now, what are the other two parashiot of Tefillin? That's easier to remember.
Shema and
Excuse
Vayam
me?
Shema. Shema and Vayam Shema.
Yes, of course. Shema and V'hayim Shema. It's the first, we call the first parsha of Shema and the second parsha of Shema. And why are these the four parashiot of the Tefillin? And the answer is because these are the four parashiot that actually mention Tefillin. Right? In Shema you have Tefillin, Totavo B'neinecha, and in Vayam Shema Tishbu, Vayam Shema, you have also the Tefillin mentioned. So these are the parashiot. Okay, so that's actually, these are the parashiot, Tefillin Shel Yad, Tefillin Shel Rosh. The question is, it's interesting, what is the pshat of the Chumash? Is the Chumash speaking about putting boxes on your hand and head? Or is it to be taken metaphorically? Doesn't mean literally put a box on your hand and your head. It's a metaphor. So who suggests that it actually is a metaphor? I mean, the Karaites suggest it's a metaphor, I believe. But who in the Jewish tradition said the pshat is not about boxing the tefillin? The pshat is you should have it on your hand and your head, and they quote the verse of the Mishnah: "Kotvei maluach libecha." Write the mitzvot on your heart. Doesn't mean you write them on your heart. It's saying keep them with you deeply, be connected to them in the deepest way, as if it's written, as it says in right. Simeni kachotama libecha. Right. Love is stronger than death. Right. As a seal, right? Place me as a seal. It doesn't mean an actual seal necessarily, right? It means we're deeply connected with each other, right? Right. Flames of God, love the flames of God. So who says over here, the pshat is not tefillin? The pshat is what the Karaites say, actually. The pshat is be deep, think about the mitzvot all the time, perform the mitzvot all the time. That's the Rashbam. The Rashbam, not surprisingly, Omek Hapshat, says the Rashbam, it doesn't mean that it's tefillin. He doesn't deny the tefillin. I'm sure he put on tefillin every day. Maybe he put on Rabbi Tom's tefillin. I have his brother's tefillin. I have no idea. Or maybe his grandfather's tefillin, Rashi. I don't know what he called. But anyway, the point is, and there's something to support that actually. There's something to support that it's not actually to be taken literally as tefillin, but a kind of metaphor, in my view. So what supports the Rashbam is the last half of the pasuk. It says, Ot al yadcha and zikaron b'neinecha. Right? It should be a sign on your hand and a memory on your between your eyes. And then the next part, Luman tiyeh Torat Hashem b'ficha, that the Torah of God should be in your mouth. And no one is suggesting you walk around all day chewing a piece of Torah, right? Torah Hashem b'ficha obviously is metaphoric. It doesn't literally mean in your mouth. So the point is, that verse might suggest to us that the whole thing is a metaphor. Now, the Ibn Ezra, it's very interesting. The Ibn Ezra, he quotes two opinions. He first says what the Rashbam says, that it's a metaphor. It doesn't mean literally tefillin. But then he says, no, but we have a tradition that in fact it is tefillin and refers to actual tefillin. And he says, it's not the same as the verse that's from Mishlei. He quotes the same verse as the Rashbam, by the way. Interesting. They think along similar lines very often. It says, because the book of Mishlei is it's called the book of Proverbs. So there it uses all kinds of, metaphorical language. It's a book of Proverbs. It's called Mishlei. But the Chumash is not Mishlei. So the Chumash is to be taken literally. Okay, anyway, it's understood by the halacha to be taken quite literally. A sign on your hand and a sign on your head,
So
on your
what do you
head,
do
between your eyes, but on your head, etc. The question is, there are many questions, but one of the questions is a simple question in which I have zero expertise. I'm familiar with the question. What in the world does totafot mean? In verse number 16, we ot al yadcha u'totafot beinenecha. What is totafot? It's a word that appears in no other place. It only appears here. So it appears in the Shema. But what does the word totafot mean? And there's all kinds of different opinions about the word totafot might mean. Many suggest it's not actually a Hebrew word. It's borrowed from some other language, Egyptian, Arabic, who knows what it's from. But in terms of a possible connection to Hebrew words, so two things come up. The word totafot, or a very similar word, appears in Tractate Shabbat, which talks about jewelry and ornaments. And totefta, whatever that similar word refers to some kind of jewels or some kind of ornaments. The other possibility is that la'atov means to surround. It's like a band. In other words, the band around your head. When one puts on tefillin on the head, of course, there's the tefillin, and then there are the ritzuah, the straps that go around one's head. So the point is that totafot beinecha is to see tefillin as some kind of an ornament. And actually, it's actually very interesting that the idea of tefillin as a kind of ornament, that actually has seems to be part and parcel of an interesting halacha, that the tefillin is an ornament. And the what I'm referring to is the practice, the common practice, and there are different practices. Ashkenazi Jews have one practice, I think, and various Sephardi Jews may have different practices. But the Ashkenazi practice is not to put on tefillin Tisha B'Av morning. And actually, not just Tisha B'Av, that the mourner, the first day of mourning, does not put on tefillin. The whole discussion in the Gemara was that tefillin are called pe'er, are called beauty. And the mourner should not put on clothing that suggests that one is actually beautiful. So we take off the tefillin. There is a practice, I believe, amongst the some Sephardi Jews not to put on the tefillin on the head. The arm you can put on, but not tefillin shel rosh. So the idea actually, in other words, but in terms of what we're studying, the Chumash, the idea would be that, once again, about memory. How does one remember this event? Well, one remembers the event, right? One remembers the event of Yetziat Mitzrayim by the idea that we have somehow some relationship with God. There shall be an ornament upon you. Now, what's curious is that in the Shema itself, at least the first paragraphs of Shema, it says nothing about Yetziat Mitzrayim. Right? It doesn't say Shema v'Ayin Shemoah does not actually explicitly mention Yetziat Mitzrayim, but this parsha does. In other words, chapter 13 of Sefer Shemot, this is where it talks about Yetziat Mitzrayim. So, in other words, the idea of the tefillin actually as a way to remember the Exodus. So it's not just by not doing something. It's not just by abstaining from not eating chametz. It's not just by even eating just matzah. It's not just by what we eat, but it's also how we appear, how we dress. And the idea that the Exodus from Egypt, that God took us to be God's servants, that we serve God, that gives us a certain standing. It's the totafot beinecha. It's a kind of ornament. It's a kind of it gives us a certain kind of beauty, as we recall that we actually serve God.
Right. Also, Chol HaMoed also, right? They don't wear tefillin.
Chol HaMoed on tefillin tefillin on Chol HaMoed is a great dispute in our tradition. And some put on tefillin on Chol HaMoed, and some do not put on tefillin on Chol HaMoed. In Israel, most people do not. There's all kinds of German Jews do put it on tefillin. So there was all kinds of discussion. But the idea of tefillin as an ornament, and it's actually interesting that, the idea of an ornament as signifying that you are connected to God in some deep way, the parallel to tefillin in our tradition, and I think it emerges from the Chumash also, is what the high priest wears on his head. The high priest, and only the high priest, has the headband. And the headband, around the headband, and in front is something called the tzitz. And the tzitz has two words on it, Kodesh Hashem. So in one reading the parsha over here, I think what the Torah maybe is suggesting is the following. The parsha ends with Totafot Beinecha. The parsha begins with Kadesh Likol B'char. God said, sanctify to me the firstborn. So the idea, I think, is perhaps Maybe this is a drush of mine, I don't know. But the idea that the experience of being delivered from Egypt was an experience not just of having freedom, being Am Chavshi, but an experience of being chosen by God, of being connected to God, connected to serve. And that is, yes, it speaks of Kadesh Kol B'chor, but we remember, of course, when God first speaks to Moshe, God says to Moshe, B'ni B'chori, Israel is my firstborn. So the idea of serving God, of being part of this people that made these commitments as part of being Kadosh, actually, that's the first verse, Kadesh Kol B'chor. And the last verse is suggesting maybe something beyond that, that it's not just Kol B'chor, that perhaps the people in general. The idea of tefillin is that you carry with you a constant memory of the Exodus, and that the way tefillin is set up, that you actually write the parsha, right? Kitvei HaKodesh, that you carry with you. It's like carrying the sacred Torah with you all the time. So that's part of your dress. It's actually a very powerful idea, that not just in terms of what you eat, for example, in terms of carrying God's word with you at all times. That is the idea of the tefillin. That I would say the idea that, in a certain sense, everybody has the potential to be a high priest. The high priest has the tzitz, Kodesh Hashem, and the tefillin, which in the Talmud, there are all kinds of parallels between tefillin and the tzitz. It's very interesting. And perhaps that's also, in a way, a very fitting conclusion to the chapter, which begins with Kadesh Kol B'chor and ends with Totafot B'nei. That's what I want to say today about just to add a few more details about chapters 12 and 13. There's much more here. Next week, we'll start with B'Shalach Paro et Ha'am, and we'll talk about the actual exodus from Egypt. It's not without its problems, obviously, and its complaints. And then hopefully in 2 weeks, we'll be able to spend some time on the Song of the Sea. If we don't get to the Song of the Sea, then we'll start the Song of the Sea the next time we meet. We still have about 60 seconds. If anybody wants to have a last word over here, a comment or question, I'd be happy to hear.
Okay.
Not the last word, but what do those people who think that tefillin is a symbolic mitzvah, what do they make with the word ikshartem la'ayis? You know, there's clearly a physical something being
Right. They take that metaphorically. They quote the verse in Mishlei, Kotveim al ruach libecha. Write them on the ruach libecha, the board of your heart. Write them on your heart. Doesn't mean you write them on your heart.
Is much more.
It means you carry them around with you all the time. They're engraved in you. They're part and parcel of you. That's how
you
they
can
take
engrave
it
something on your heart, but you can't tie anything to your heart.
No, I understand. I'm saying I understand that, but what I said is that the first verse, which talks about in order that the Torah be in your mouth, nobody suggests the Torah is in your mouth.
Right.
You know what I mean? So obviously that Torah Hashem B'ficha means actually it's the way you talk, it's the way you interact, basically. That's the idea of it. The way you behave, the way you act, the way you think. That's what they would suggest. The idea of the way you're thinking a certain way, it's through in Shorosh. The ones on your hand is the way you act, and Beficha is the way you talk. The idea of being a whole person. This is an aspiration. It's not easy to fulfill this, but the idea of seeing oneself in every way, in every interaction, as someone that trying to aspire to do the right thing in all that we do. What would God say about the way we behave? And that's the question. To measure it by that standard, not by our own standards, but what is the right thing to do? Have that sense that we can, that we have an obligation to do our best to be in conformity with God's will. I would say. I think that is the easier said than done, obviously. But I guess it would be metaphorically the way you think, the way you act, and the way you speak. I think those are the three areas that the Rashbam would say. The Rashbam did not deny that we put on tefillin, believe me. The Rashbam in general has his pshat of the Chumash, and then Rashbam wrote a commentary basically on the whole Talmud. It's Rashi's grandson. We don't have all the Rashbam's commentary, but the Rashbam was a very important Talmudist, a great Talmudist actually. So he hardly denied the idea of Torah Shabbat Peh. What he's saying is they're two distinct things. he never, to the best of my knowledge, makes any attempt to relate one to the other. The Ramban is different. The Ramban also writes the great commentary on the Torah, great Talmudist, obviously, but he attempts very often to try to connect the two. The Rashbam, for whatever reason, at least in writing, made no such attempt, which is curious in its own right. All right, I'll have to stop at this
Rabbi
point, I guess.
Silber,
Yes.
one
Go
more
ahead.
thing, one
Go
more
ahead.
thing. To
Yes,
pull
please.
together your drash or pulling together these two paragraphs in chapter 13, the Kadeshli, and then ending with the Totafot, that's what God said. You are a Goy Kadosh and a Mamlechet Kohanim.
Right, for sure, 100%. And the Ramban makes that point. Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. That the Ramban makes that point when he talks about the structure of the Book of Exodus. He says the Book of Exodus, unlike Rashi, ends with the Mishkan. V'shachanti b'tocham, because a holy people need a holy space, and the goal is basically Kadoshim Tiyu. That's the Rashbam. That's the Ramban against Rashi. Rashi said the mitzvah is Kadoshim is no, Kadoshim Tiyu is not detail. Kadoshim Tiyu is the goal. The Torah usually helps you get there. For some people, it doesn't get us there. It can be a bad guy and keep the Torah, says the Ramban. Okay, but the goal at the end of the day is exactly as you say. Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. Okay, that is a good last word, actually. And so next week, hopefully, we continue with B'Shalach. And we will, again, we have not exhausted anything here, but we're touching on some of the main points, I think. Okay, very good. Thank you all. Have a good day.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Silber. Thank you to everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to everyone whose questions we couldn't get to. I am deeply sorry. Thank you all for sharing so many thoughts today. It was nice to hear them or see them as they came through in chat. Learning will continue. You can sign up at grisha.org/classes. And with that, I wish everyone a good day and take care.